It burned slowly at first. The fabric caught at the hem, then the bodice, then the sleeves. And within minutes, 14 months of work, 2 continents of meaning, and a price tag that would have stopped the room, was ash. A woman stood in a backyard in Seoul and watched it happen. She did not cry. She did not move. She did not say a single word, because she already knew something the woman holding the match had no idea about. A wedding dress was just destroyed. But what was actually destroyed, what that family had no idea they had just put a flame to, was something that belonged to the world. Something documented. Something appraised. Something that lawyers in 2 countries would soon be fighting over. 3 questions. Who was the woman with the match? And what kind of rage drives a person to burn another woman's wedding dress the night before a wedding? Who was the bride standing there in silence? And why wasn't she afraid? And why, when she watched it burn, did she already know what was going to happen next? By the time you have your answers, you will understand why the silence was the most powerful thing in that backyard. Her name is Adorara. No, wait. That's not where this story starts. This story starts in a studio in Brooklyn, built over a decade into something quietly extraordinary by a woman who knew, from the time she was a child watching her mother's hands move across fabric, exactly what she was going to do with her life. Adorara studied textile arts, then fashion design. She knew by then who to find and what to ask for, including a master weaver in Oshogbo named Babatunde, one of fewer than a dozen living practitioners still producing traditional ashoke at the highest level of complexity, a man whose work she had studied long before she had a reason to commission it. Her work showed up in the right rooms: cultural exhibitions, private collections, conversations between people who understood what they were looking at. She was precise, disciplined, and completely herself. Now London, 2016. Adorara was 29, finishing a postgraduate research fellowship on West African textile traditions. He was 31, a structural engineering student from Seoul, 3 weeks from his dissertation defense, perpetually tired, perpetually composed. They met at a seminar neither of them particularly wanted to attend. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who, when he did speak, said exactly what he meant. Adorara was the kind of woman who could fill a room with her thinking. Not noise, thinking, the kind that makes other people sit up straighter without knowing why. It wasn't immediate. It was slower than that. Coffees that ran long. Library tables they kept ending up at together. A walk home in November rain where neither of them suggested stopping. By the time they admitted what it was already serious. Adorara brought him home first. And her family, her mother, her aunties, her uncle who asked every man his intentions within 4 minutes of meeting him. They opened the door wide. There was jollof on the stove before he arrived. Her mother shook his hand and then ignored protocol entirely and hugged him. Her youngest auntie told him he was too thin and made it her personal mission. His father shook Adorara's hand. Carefully. The way you shake the hand of something you haven't decided about yet. That was the first visit. After that, phone calls. Long ones in Korean behind closed doors. Adorara didn't speak Korean then. She didn't need to. She could read the temperature of a room. She could read the temperature of a marriage. She knew. And she made a decision, not to shrink, not to audition, not to perform palatable. Instead, Adorara went to her studio, pulled out her sketchbook, and began designing the most important garment of her career. Her wedding dress. Not a dress borrowed from someone else's tradition. Not a compromise. A bridge, hand-woven ashoke, a traditional Yoruba prestige fabric, from a master weaver in Oshogbo, deep indigo and gold, combined with Korean silk from a heritage house in Gyeongju, a city that has been the center of Korean heritage craft for 1,000 years, that had been weaving for 3 generations. 2 cultures, 1 body, 1 woman who refused to pretend she was only half of what she was. Her mother flew to New York for 2 weeks to help with the finishing work. They sat together on the studio floor, Chidima hand-stitching the hem the way she had stitched everything, with total attention, with total love. She looked up at her daughter and said, "Make it so beautiful they forget to be afraid." Adorara nodded, kept sketching. But what she was creating wasn't just a dress. And some people in Seoul were about to find out exactly what that meant. Now let's talk about the woman holding the match. Her name is Hyunja. And before you decide everything about her in the next 30 seconds, stay with this. Because the most dangerous people in stories like this are rarely monsters. They are people who believe completely and without question that they are right. Hyunja was 61 years old, the wife of a retired civil engineer, the mother of one son, whom she had raised to be everything she believed a man should be. Educated, respected, positioned. She had sacrificed for that positioning in ways that were real, in ways that cost her. And in Korean society, particularly in her generation, in her circle, where a family's reputation was a living thing that required constant tending, who her son married was not a private matter. It was a public one. But it is a context. And context is how we understand how someone arrives at a backyard with a match in their hand and calls it protection. Hyunja had a plan for her son's life. She had, if she was honest, already identified 2 or 3 women she considered appropriate. Women from families she knew. Women whose backgrounds she could trace. Women who fit, neatly, cleanly, into the future she had been quietly constructing for 20 years. Then her son called from London. And none of the words that came after matched anything in her plan. The first scheduled meeting, a lunch in Seoul that had taken 6 weeks to arrange, Hyunja cancelled the morning of. Her son relayed the message to Adora with a careful voice. A voice trying to carry water without spilling it. Something came up. She's sorry. Adora said, "Okay, we'll try again." And she meant it. That matters too. The second attempt was a family dinner. Formal. 8 people at a table that felt like a courtroom. Hyunja sat at the head. She placed Adora at the far end, separated by 4 family members, a language barrier, and what can only be described as a wall of deliberate exclusion. The entire dinner was conducted in Korean. No translation offered. None. When relatives asked about Adora, her work, her background, her family, Hyunja answered. In Korean, referring to her future daughter-in-law in the third person. She is a designer of some kind. In New York. Not, this is the woman my son loves. Not, let me introduce her. Not, she has a name. She. Adora sat through 3 hours of that dinner. She ate what was placed in front of her. She smiled when people made eye contact. She asked her husband quietly once what was being discussed. He said, "Nothing important." That was a lie. And they both knew it. In the car afterward, Adora looked out the window at Seoul moving past, and she made a private calculation. She thought, I have not come this far, built what I have built, made what I have made, to perform smallness for anyone. Not even for this. And she decided to stay. 2 weeks later, Hyunja called her son. He took the call in the hallway of their hotel. Adora could hear the tone through the door. The particular frequency of a conversation that is not going the direction someone wants. What Hyunja said, and he told Adora later, in full, because by then he understood that she deserved the truth, was this. This woman is not for you. She is not one of us. Think about your future children. Think about what you are doing to this family. I did not spend my life building something for you to walk away from it for a person who doesn't understand what we are. He told his mother he loved her. He told his mother he was getting married. He did not tell Adora how long the call lasted. He did not tell her everything his mother said after that. He kept believing, the way people believe in things they need to be true. That time would soften it. That presence would build something. That love eventually would be persuasive enough. He was wrong. Adora booked the flights to Seoul. She packed the dress. But none of that, none of it, prepared either of them for what happened 2 days before the wedding. Adora chose Seoul. Think about that for a moment. After everything, the cancelled lunch, the dinner where she sat invisible at the end of a table, the phone call her husband wouldn't fully translate, Adora chose to get married in Seoul. Not because she had to. Because she decided that if there was any chance of building something with this family, she was going to give it every possible condition to grow. She was going to show up. Fully. On their ground. In their city. That was who she was. The wedding was planned for a venue in Bukshan. A place of quiet, architectural beauty, the kind of setting that holds ceremony without overwhelming it. Guest list kept intentionally small. Intimate. Another concession. Another olive branch extended across a distance that only seemed to grow. The dress traveled separately. It shipped from Adora's Brooklyn studio in a specialized archival garment case. the kind used to transport pieces for museum exhibitions. Hard-sided, climate-controlled lining, logged and documented, because that was the correct way to transport something of its nature. And here's where this story shifts. Because that dress, the one Hyunja had already decided was a problem before she'd seen it clearly, was not simply a wedding dress. It never was. Every choice had been documented, because by the time the dress was 3/4 finished, word had reached people whose interest changes what something is worth. Not just privately, legally. A fashion archivist based in Paris, a woman whose opinion moved markets and shaped collections, had reached out to Adorara's studio directly. She had heard about the piece through a colleague. She wanted to see it, wanted to discuss acquisition for an archival collection she was building around contemporary diaspora textile work. A museum in Lagos had made contact. Formal inquiry. Subject line, potential acquisition. Ashoke Contemporary Commission. Adorara read both messages, responded to both professionally, and then went back to her studio and kept sewing. Because she was going to wear it first. That was always the plan. It was her dress before it was anyone's acquisition. It was her marriage before it was anyone's collection piece. She wore it first. That decision, that singular, personal, completely reasonable decision, is what makes everything that follows so devastating. Now, Hyunja saw the dress for the first time the day after they arrived. Not in the way you'd hope a mother-in-law sees a bride's dress. Not with curiosity, not with the complicated grace of a woman making room for something new. She saw it the way someone sees a threat they've already decided how to handle. She looked at the indigo and gold, the ashoke structured at the bodice, the Korean silk falling from the waist in a single, unbroken line. And she said, "It's a costume, a performance, an embarrassment, something that would make them look," the word she used translated later, ridiculous. She walked away from it, and then she made phone calls. Who she called, what she said, was not something anyone fully reconstructed until later. What is known is that those calls lasted into the evening. That her husband, who knew her well enough to know when she was building toward something, tried twice to redirect the conversation and failed both times. Something was being decided, without Adorara, without her husband, in Korean, behind closed doors. Adorara spent that evening in their hotel room going over the rehearsal schedule. She set the garment case beside the wardrobe, the hard-sided archival case, latched, documented, exactly where she could see it. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the destruction of a formally documented artwork on Korean soil carried civil exposure that a family dispute could not contain. Adorara went to sleep, and on the night before the wedding rehearsal, while she slept, the garment case was moved from the hotel room. He had a key to the room. She had never thought to ask for it back. Adorara didn't notice until morning. Adorara woke up at 6:47 in the morning. She remembered the exact time later because she looked at her phone first, habit, before she looked at the wardrobe. Before she registered the weight of the silence in the room. Before she understood that something was wrong in a way that hadn't fully formed into language yet. She looked at the wardrobe. The garment case was gone. Not moved. Not misplaced. Gone. Adorara checked the bathroom. The closet shelf. The space beside the bed where she sometimes set it when the room felt too warm. She checked all of these places in the methodical way a person checks things when they already know the answer and are not yet ready to accept it. Then she called her husband. It rang, and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called his sister. One ring, then silence. The particular silence of a call declined. Adorara got dressed. She did not allow herself to fall apart in that hotel room because she understood, at some cellular level, that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford right now. She needed information first. She needed to see. She took a taxi to the family home. The front door was unlocked. Adorara walked through it. She walked through the house, through the living room with its careful furniture and its framed family photographs, not one of which she appeared in, and out through the back, into the backyard. Hyunja was standing beside a metal drum in the center of the yard. Arms folded, posture straight. The expression on her face was not rage. Rage would have been easier to understand. It was composure. The composure of a woman who had made a decision and was prepared to stand behind it. The drum was still producing heat. still producing the last thin lines of smoke that rise from something after the burning is already finished. Inside it, or what remained inside it, was ash. And fragments. A section of Korean silk, blackened at the edge. A piece of ashaoke weave collapsed into itself. The gold threading that had taken Adorara weeks to source, fused now into nothing recognizable. 14 months. Gone. Her husband was standing 6 feet from his mother. He was staring at the drum. He had been there from the beginning. Adorara understood that immediately. He had watched it happen, and he had not moved. Adorara stood at the back door of that house, and she looked at all of it. And she did not scream. She stood completely still. She did not give Hyunja the explosion, if that is what she was waiting for. Hyunja looked at her, and she spoke. Now you will wear something appropriate, or there will be no wedding. Said it the way you say something you rehearsed. The way you say something you decided on in the dark the night before, and have been holding in your mouth since morning. Adorara turned her eyes to her husband. He stood there with the particular stillness of a man who has just understood, too late, the exact size of what he failed to do. He found his voice then. Finally. After all of it, after the cancelled lunch, after the dinner, after the phone calls he didn't fully translate, after standing 6 feet from a burning drum and not stopping it, he found his voice. And he used it to apologize. To his mother. Not to Adorara. To his mother, a soft, careful, heartbroken apology for the situation. For the conflict. For the difficulty of it all. Adorara looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned around, walked back through that house, back through the careful furniture and the framed photographs. Out the front door. Into a taxi. Back to the hotel. Adorara sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up her phone. She called her mother in Lagos. Chidima, who had sat at a sewing machine in a one-bedroom apartment in Enugu every morning before the sun came up. Because daylight cost electricity, and electricity cost money they didn't always have. Who had fed her children with her hands. Who had taught her daughter, by the time that daughter was old enough to watch, that fabric is not just fabric. That it holds time. That it holds intention. That it holds the person who made it. Who had flown to New York and sat on the studio floor in Brooklyn, hand-stitching the hem of that dress, and had looked up and said, "Make it so beautiful they forget to be afraid." Answered on the second ring. Adorara said 3 words. "Mama, it's gone." And the line was quiet for a long time. What the mother-in-law did not know, what no one in that family knew, as they stood in that backyard convincing themselves they had solved something, was that she had just destroyed something that didn't belong to her in the way she thought. Not even close. Adorara sat in that hotel room for 47 minutes. We know it was 47 minutes because she logged the time herself later, when she was reconstructing the sequence of events for her attorney. That is the kind of mind she had. That is the kind of woman Adorara was. Even in the worst moment of her adult life, some part of her was already organizing, already documenting, already understanding that what had just happened was not only personal. It was legal. The first call was to her attorney in New York. A woman she had worked with for 6 years, contracts, intellectual property, studio agreements. Someone who knew her work. Who knew specifically what the dress was and what had been done to protect it. The call lasted 11 minutes. By the end of it, her attorney was already drafting. The second call was to Adorara's studio manager in Brooklyn, the person who held the physical documentation, the appraisal certificates, the insurance policy, the shipping manifests, the correspondence with the archivist in Paris and the museum in Lagos, the authentication records for the ashaoke fabric and the Gyeongju silk. All of it. Logged. Time-stamped. Legally sound. Because here is what Adorara understood that Hyunja did not. When you build something of genuine cultural and artistic value, you protect it. You document it. You ensure it. Not because you expect the worst, but because you are a professional, and professionals understand that the world does not always treat valuable things as though they are valuable. Adorara had learned that lesson early. Now let's talk about what was actually in that garment case. The dress had been formally appraised 14 weeks before the wedding, not as a garment, but as a cultural textile artwork. The appraiser was a specialist in contemporary diaspora textile work, based in London, whose assessments were recognized by 3 major international auction houses and used as the basis for insurance policies across Europe and North America. Her assessment was specific, documented, signed. The Ashoke Foundation fabric, the hand-woven work produced by Babatunde in Oshogbo, was not simply rare at the time of the commission. By the time that dress arrived in Seoul, Babatunde, the man Adorara had tracked down, commissioned, and spent 8 months in correspondence with, had passed away, quietly in his sleep, for months before the wedding. The textile community that knew his work understood immediately what that meant. Adorara had been one of the last people to commission him. What he had made for her no longer had a living source. There were no more pieces coming. What existed was what existed. And what Adorara had commissioned, a full-length Ashoke weave of that complexity and that pattern, was now categorically irreplaceable. The Korean silk from Gyeongju carried its own authentication. The Heritage House had provided provenance documentation as a condition of the sale, something they did for every significant commission, because they understood the value of what they produced, even when buyers didn't. Together, documented, authenticated, irreplaceable. The insurance policy, filed under an art and artifact category, not a standard wedding dress rider, a categorization that set the coverage limit not in thousands, but in a number that belongs in a different conversation entirely, covered the dress at a valuation that, when converted to Korean won and set against publicly available property records, exceeded the market value of the family home in Hyeonja's neighborhood in Seoul. It exceeded their combined documented liquid assets by a significant margin. And there was one more layer. A Korean heritage textile institution, based in Seoul, state-affiliated, the kind of organization that carries institutional weight in ways that matter to families like Hyeonja's, had been in correspondence with Adorara's studio for 3 months before the wedding. They were interested in the design documentation, the process records, the cultural synthesis methodology. They had used the phrase significant contribution to contemporary Korean textile dialogue in a formal letter. A letter written in Seoul, addressed to a studio in Brooklyn, about a dress that was, at that moment, ash in a metal drum in a Seoul backyard. A letter that was now part of the legal file. Hyeonja had not burned a dress she found offensive. She had destroyed a formally documented, professionally appraised, fully insured, culturally significant artwork on Korean soil that her own country's heritage institutions had identified as valuable. The insurance claim was filed within 24 hours. An investigator arrived in Seoul 48 hours after that. Not a local adjuster. A specialist, the kind sent when the numbers are large enough to require someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. He looked at the ash in the metal drum. He looked at the documentation Adorara's studio had sent overnight. And then the Korean legal system became involved. Because the destruction of a documented artwork on Korean soil by a Korean national is not a private family matter. It is a civil matter, with exposure. Hyeonja's family hired an attorney. Her husband's father did not join the legal response. He called his son once, briefly, and said very little. But what he said, his son repeated to Adorara word for word, and she kept it. And then they sat, for the first time, across a table from Adorara's legal team. The family that had cancelled lunches, that had seated her at the end of a table and spoken about her in the third person, that had burned what she made and told her to wear something appropriate. They sat across that table, and they began to understand the full weight of what had been done in that backyard. The silence in that room, by all accounts, was total. She had burned a dress, and the world, it turned out, kept receipts. Justice, when it actually arrives, rarely looks the way you imagined it would. It arrives slowly, with paperwork, and with a cost that touches everyone in the room. The legal process moved with a pace that surprised the family. Their attorney, a man accustomed to handling disputes that stayed quiet, that were resolved between people who understood the value of discretion, quickly realized that this case had a dimension his clients had not anticipated. It was not simply a civil matter between two families. The moment the Korean Heritage Textile Institution's correspondence entered the legal record, the case acquired a cultural dimension that neither side could fully control. Korean media found it within the week. Not the tabloids. The cultural press first, journalists who covered art, heritage, craft, the ongoing conversation about what Korea preserves and what it loses. They wrote about the Gyeongju silk. about a state-affiliated institution's formal interest in a piece that no longer existed, about the Asha Weaver whose work was now gone from the world in one more way it didn't need to be gone. Then the broader press picked it up. The story stopped being about one family's wedding and became something larger, a conversation about cultural value, about what we decide is worth protecting and what we decide is expendable, and about who gets to make that call. Hyenja's name was not published, but in the circles that mattered to her, the circles she had spent decades carefully maintaining, people began to ask questions. The social architecture she had spent 20 years constructing developed a crack. For a woman who had burned a dress partly out of fear of what people would say, the particular cruelty of that outcome is not lost. The family's financial exposure was confirmed, assessed, and documented. Their attorney advised settlement. There was no realistic alternative that did not carry significantly worse consequences. And then her husband came to the hotel. He knocked. Adora opened the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she let him stand there. He came in. He sat down. He did not reach for her hand. He said, "I should have protected you. From the beginning. I kept telling myself it would get better. That she would come around. That time would do something I wasn't willing to do myself. I let you walk into every one of those situations without standing in front of it first. And I stood in that backyard and I couldn't move. I couldn't move. And then I apologized to her." He stopped. "I understand if that's the end. I need you to know I understand that. What happened was a long, quiet, painful conversation between two people who loved each other and were now required to be completely honest about what that love had and hadn't done, about what he had failed to do, about what Adora had absorbed in silence and what that silence had cost her, about whether the architecture of a marriage could be built on ground this damaged. They talked for a long time. No resolution that night. No answer. Just two people finally fully in the same room with the truth. Now the settlement. Adora had every legal basis to pursue the maximum claim. Her attorney had built a case that was, by any objective measure, strong. The numbers were documented. The liability was clear. She could have taken everything the exposure allowed for, and no court would have faulted her. Adora sat with that option for 2 days. She thought about what maximum exposure would produce. Money, yes, and the clean satisfaction of consequence delivered at full weight. She thought about what it would leave behind. And she made a decision not about what she was owed, but about what she wanted to exist in the world when this was over. Out of something more considered than revenge. Out of a decision about what she wanted this to build, rather than what she wanted it to destroy. Adora negotiated. A significant portion of the settlement was directed to a textile arts scholarship fund, established in her mother Chidima's name, specifically for young West African designers pursuing formal study in textile arts and fashion. The first cohort would be 3 recipients. The fund was structured to continue beyond the initial settlement. A second portion funded a cultural exchange program, a formal, structured initiative connecting Nigerian and Korean artisans, weavers, textile researchers, designers, the kind of cross-cultural dialogue that the dress itself had been trying to start. Adora asked for one thing personally. Not money, not a public statement. A formal, documented, written apology from Hyenja. Signed, notarized, entered into the legal record. Not for her to read every morning, not to frame and hang somewhere. For the record. Because what had been done deserved to exist, officially, as something that was done, and acknowledged, and could not be rewritten later into something more comfortable. Hyenja's attorney brought her the document. She sat with it for 2 days. And then she signed it. The apology, when Adora's attorney read it to her over the phone, was not warm. It did not contain the words she might have wanted to hear in a different world. It was formal, legally precise. The language of a woman who had been brought to a table she never expected to sit at, and was doing what the situation now required of her. It was not a hug. It was not a redemption arc. It was real. And Adora, the woman who had stood completely still in a backyard in Seoul while her life's work turned to ash, who had walked back to a hotel and called her mother with 3 words, who had then sat down and built something lasting out of the wreckage. She listened to that apology read back to her over the phone. And she said, "Good. File it. Sometimes real is everything." The wedding did not happen in Seoul. There was no dramatic cancellation announcement. No formal statement. The venue booking was quietly released. The small guest list was quietly informed. The city that had taken so much from Adora in the space of 72 hours was not going to be the city where she began her marriage. She went home first. Back to Brooklyn. Back to the studio. Back to the work table where the whole thing had started. The sketchbooks, the fabric swatches, the reference photographs pinned to the wall. Adora didn't rush anything. She didn't fill the silence with noise or activity or the performance of being fine. She let it be what it was. And then, when she was ready, when it came from the right place, she went back to work. 6 months later. A garden outside Lagos. Her mother's garden, the kind of space that takes decades to become what it is. Old trees. Uneven ground. The particular quality of late afternoon light in Lagos. The kind that makes everything look already remembered. 40 people. Immediate family, close friends, the people whose presence meant something rather than the people whose presence looked like something. No ceremony designed to impress. No architecture of performance. Just a marriage. Adora wore a piece from her studio, made in the months between Seoul and this garden, made with the same hands, the same intention, the same understanding of what fabric holds. Simpler in construction. Not lesser. Simpler in the way that things become when they no longer need to prove themselves to anyone. Her mother stood beside her for the whole of it, and watched her daughter get married. And across the garden, quiet and slightly apart from the main gathering, sat a man who had traveled from Seoul. Her husband's father. He had come alone. He had booked his own flight. He had told his son 3 days before the wedding, without being asked, without negotiation, that he would be there. He sat in that garden in Lagos and he watched his son marry Adora. And at the end of it he found her and he held both of her hands in his, and he didn't say very much. But what he said he meant. That was enough. Hyunja did not come. No one expected her to. No one asked her to. The legal process had run its course. The apology was filed. What existed between them now was not warmth. It was not going to become warmth, but it was defined. It had edges. It was honest about what it was. She sent a card. A physical card, handwritten, delivered to the studio address in Brooklyn 3 days before the wedding. The handwriting was careful. The words were few. Adora read it once. And then she kept it. Not displayed. Not hidden. Kept, in the way you keep things that are complicated and true, because throwing them away doesn't make them less complicated and less true. It just makes you less honest about your own history. Adora gave one interview about all of it. Not a long one. She was characteristically precise about what she was willing to say and what she was keeping for herself. But she said this. I didn't make that dress to prove anything to anyone. It was mine. It was my history and his history and what I believed we could be together, all of it held in one piece of work. And someone decided that was a threat. But what happened after showed me something I already knew and sometimes forget. That our work, our culture, our art, the things we make with full knowledge of where we come from, has value. Real, documented, legal, undeniable value. Even when someone tries to unmake it. She paused. Especially then. The exchange program has since facilitated 4 residencies. 2 Nigerian weavers in Gyeongju. 2 Korean textile researchers in Lagos. The heritage house that supplied the silk for the original dress is now in formal correspondence with a textile institute in Abeokuta. Something is being built. Now the scholarship. The kdrama Fund, as it came to be called, made its first 3 awards 8 months after the settlement. Young designers. West African. At various stages of their formal education. Each of them working in textile arts in ways that carried cultural specificity. Work that knew where it came from. The 3rd recipient was Korean. A young woman from Daegu studying the intersection of traditional Korean textile techniques and contemporary West African dyeing methods. Her portfolio, when the selection committee reviewed it, referenced the cultural exchange program that had been established as part of the same settlement that funded her award. She was building on something she didn't know had been built in fire. In her studio in Brooklyn, on the wall above the work table, there is a single framed photograph. Not of the dress. There are no photographs of the finished dress because it was meant to be worn, not displayed, and then it was gone. It is a photograph of her mother's hands. Mid-stitch. taken on the studio floor in Brooklyn during those 2 weeks when kdrama came to help finish the hem. Adorara works under it every day. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you weren't expecting to feel when you clicked play, share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Adorara's don't belong in one place. They belong everywhere. And before you go, tell me something in the comments. Because I genuinely want to know. What would you have done in her place? At the hotel door, after the burning, what would your next move have been? But I think what you say will tell you something about yourself. If you're new here, this is what we do. We find the stories that matter. The ones that don't get told the way they deserve. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and come back. Because the next one is already waiting.